Good morning. Today we are going to start going through Hatchet. We're going to begin by talking about Hatchet and survival. And part of that idea of Hatchet and survival, for me, has always been a problem. And part of that problem is the idea of verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is a word that I mispronounce frequently, and it's an important element of literature like survival stories. And so, because when I first heard about Hatchet 4 or 5 years ago, I had a tough time believing the basic premise that a 13-year-old boy could survive 54 days in the wilderness by himself. And so when I read it the first time, looking uh, to decide whether or not I was going to include this in a young adult adolescent lit class, I had a lot of problems setting aside or creating, excuse me, had a lot of problems creating the willing suspension of disbelief. And so I'm going to run through why I think the novel has at least a bit of verisimilitude, enough for me to have the willing suspension of disbelief, and enough for me to set aside my doubts and believe that Brian could survive 54 days in the wilderness. First, let's do a quick review. Verisimilitude is a term we've talked about before. It's the appearance of being true or real. A lot of times, that appearance of being true or real, I think, was easier in paper towns. But it is equally important in novels like this one because we have to believe that it's possible for Brian to survive. Uh, it'd be nice if we could believe it was probable that he survived. Also, I think it's important for novels like The Hunger Games. Is the premise, is there some verisimilitude in the premise? The Planet, New World, and The Knife of Never Letting Go, can we buy into that? Okay. Can we, have enough accuracy, uh, real world verisimilitude for magical realism like Holes? As I've said several times already, verisimilitude is necessary for literature because it helps create that willing suspension of disbelief. And that's what keeps us reading. Um, if we can't do that, if we can't believe that it's probable or possible, we're likely going to put the book down. So when I started thinking about this book, um, I started watching a bunch of survival videos on YouTube, and there are a crap ton. In fact, I believe there's a metric crap ton of survival videos on YouTube. And one of the things that a great many survival videos on YouTube do or talk about is the 10 C's of survival. And the 10 C's of survival come from a person named Dave Canterbury. And Mr. Canterbury was on a reality TV show for several years. And it was one of those survival shows where he and a partner were placed in survival situations and taking these risks in order to see if they had the skills to survive. Canterbury says that there are 10 C's to survival for ordinary folk if we are skilled enough to implement everything properly. And these 10 C's are broken down into cutting tool, combustion device, cover, container, cordage, compass, candling device, cotton bandana, cargo tape, and canvas needle. Canterbury says that the first five are the most important. And if we look at the novel, Brian doesn't have a compass and he doesn't walk very far from camp. It really wasn't necessary. It was one of the smart things he did, staying close to the plane, staying close to camp. Candling device is, a candle, a flashlight, something to illuminate the dark. And again, once he got fire, you had the candling device or enough of one to make everything work. Cotton bandana um, is important because it can be used as a bandage. It can be used to cut into little pieces and create what's called char cloth through a process that I certainly don't have the skills to create. Uh, Cargo tape is a excuse me. Cargo tape is a fancy word for duct tape. And when I was a farm boy, there were kind of two rules. If it moved and it shouldn't, you use duct tape to tie it down. If it didn't move and it should, you use WD-40 to loosen it up. And then finally, there was a canvas needle. These are kind of big, long, sometimes they're called a sail needle, used for sewing sails and canvas. And again, it would be necessary for repairs. You could sew your clothes if they were ripped. He could have, I don't think it would have worked on his windbreaker, but it would have worked on jeans or something like that. So we're going to look at the 10 C's of survival, and we're going to look at what Brian had and didn't have, and we're going to look at how the book created the 10 C's or developed the 10 C's of survival, unwittingly probably, but it was that use of the 10 C's that allowed me to create a willing suspension of disbelief. First of all, the cutting tool. The book's named Hatchet. Brian has a hatchet. Brian has a cutting tool. I might want to pick nits and say I have a tough time believing that it stayed sharp for him to do everything. But again, it was probably cheap steel, and cheap steel, he has flint. He had other stones available where he could have worked to sharpen it and keep an edge on it. Um, Even though there were a couple of chips, it would have worked. Combustion device, he doesn't have one in the traditional sense. He doesn't have matches, he doesn't have a lighter, he doesn't have any of those things. However, there was, again, the hatchet. It struck sparks. He discovered that in the cave. And once he got the fire, he didn't leave the fire. The fire was super important to him. The fire was his friend. The fire gave him comfort and assurance. It allowed him to cook his fish. It allowed him to cook the birds. It allowed him to sharpen the points on sticks. The combustion device basically was something that allowed him to kind of save his life. All right. And so it was a complicated process, but he had one. And to tie it back to the bushcrafters or the survivalists, a lot of them talk about not a hatchet necessarily, but they talk about having a knife, and that knife should have a 45, or excuse me, a 90-degree spine so that you can use it to strike sparks in a ferrocerium rod that you're always supposed to have with you. And then later on, it talks about he kept getting better at building fires, and he loved the idea of the lighter. It made everything super easy for him. So the fire part is developed. So he's got combustion, he had to work at it, he's got the cutting tool, and he's got enough of a cutting tool that makes me believe it'll last for the 54 days, which brings us then to cover. It starts out with the fact that he doesn't have cover, that his jacket is ripped to shreds, that the mosquitoes are biting him something fierce, and that he really doesn't have any way to protect himself from the mosquitoes. Later on, however, he does get cover, and he talks about the fact that it's almost a perfect shelter. It's stronger than a lean to, it's dry because there's an overhang that creates a watertight roof. He has a doorway, he can get in and out. He has his perfect shelter. So now, once again, we have the first three C's taken care of. If we keep going, we've got a problem. He doesn't have a container. He has no way to cook them. And they're consistent, Paulson is consistent as an author by no container magically appears until he gets the bag out of the plane at the very end of the novel. So he is always kind of spearing the bird and putting it in the fire, spearing the fish and putting them in the fire. Um, he's living without a container. There's a certain irony that the vast majority of us in the year 2020 are walking around with water containers in our backpacks. And in 2020, this would be something that he would have had with him. The bigger irony would be that in 2020, it's very unlikely that his mom would have given him a hatchet to take to the Canadian wilderness. Hopefully, she would have given him a Swiss Army knife. Cordage. The book at least acknowledges the cordage. He didn't have string. It mentions that with fishing. It mentions that several other times. The quotation I'm taking from mentions it as far as the book or the bow. He doesn't have the string. And at least the idea of taking the shoelaces, having one long shoelace to make the bowstring, and cutting the other one in half and keeping his shoes tied, I'm willing to buy it. It's not perfect, um, but at least he has some cordage. At least he has some way to use the cordage, and and Paulson acknowledges the cordage is necessary. So of the five C's, he has no container. He has the other four, and at this part, I guess I am starting to set aside the willing suspension of disbelief. He has the majority of the tools. It should be possible. The next thing that I want to talk about is the thing called the rules of threes. And I believe it's another reason that there is some verisimilitude in the novel. The rule of threes begins with this idea of 3 seconds without spirit and hope. And from the plane crash at the very beginning, I'm alive. It could have been different. There could have been death. I could have been done. He's got some spirit. He's got some hope at the very beginning. Later on, he talks about the idea of remembering Perpich, Perpich telling him to get motivated, Perpich giving him those self esteem talks about you are your most valuable asset. Don't forget that. You are the best thing you have. So he has spirit and hope. He's going to survive 3 seconds. He's going to survive 3 days, perhaps. And then later on, we've got he did not know how long it took. He learned the most important rule of survival: feeling sorry for yourself doesn't work. Again, the rule of threes, Paulson is working that in. The 10 C's, Paulson is working that in. And so my ability to set aside the willing suspension of disbelief keeps growing, and Paulson is tying things into what survivalists, experts, or at least celebrities who claim to be experts say will work. 3 minutes without air, once he gets out of the water, once he gets out of the plane, that's not a problem. 3 hours without shelter. There's two things here. First of all, he recognizes that he needs the shelter, and he recognizes he needed something to eat. Both of those things are important. And then once again, the quotation from page 56, he has found this perfect shelter. Shelter is in both rule of threes and the 10 C's. I think it's important to understand that Brian understands the importance of shelter. And again, I can believe that a 13-year-old would understand the importance of shelter. Everything everybody thinks about in Canada would be freezing to death, even if it's in the middle of summer. 3 days without water, page 58 of my version, Brian has lots of water. We're in good shape. 3 weeks without food. If we take a look at this, we've got the berries on page 61. We've got the turtle eggs on page 96 through 99. We've got his first fish on page 121. All of those are within the first 2 or 3 days, not the first 3 weeks. Now, I think it's important to understand here that 3 days without water, people are probably in trouble in a day and a half being dehydrated and not being able to think straight. People are probably in trouble within a week of not having enough food and not being able to think straight. So again, Paulson doesn't push it to the extremes. He doesn't have Brian almost starving. This is within the first day, the first 2 days, and it again becomes believable because he finds food quickly and he's able to cook and eat quickly enough so that the risk of starvation isn't there. And also, Paulson, I think, does a great job of showing that Brian lost a lot of body fat, that Brian has, learned, his body seems to take in the food it has and use it better than the rest of us do, because it's working on less and it's gotten used to working on less. Finally, there's the 3 months without companionship or love. And 54 days is less than 2 months. So again, Paulson doesn't push that limit. He is able to be well within the believability realm here. It's less than 2 months, not three. And we can once again believe that Brian is going to be okay. And so, with the 5 C's and with the rule of threes, we can believe it could happen. We have to have a stretch in our belief that Brian could remember everything from TV and make it work like it had on TV. But if he's the sort of kid who had played creating shelters in the park, who had watched survival shows on TV, maybe he's the sort of kid who could do it. So the verisimilitude is here. And I think that that is one of the reasons that I chose the book, because it does become believable and it does tie in with what we know about survival. The other reason I chose the book will be in the next lecture. Hope everybody has a good day, and we'll talk to you on Friday.